Hello and welcome back to Language Culture and Dr. Lou. And today let's talk about how sometimes some big brands who are trying to expand and offer their products to international markets end up really blundering translations of things. And a lot of these examples, yeah, you'll see some things that are pretty funny, but as far as the investors of these businesses go, it's not such good news, right? Because they screw up a translation, then people don't want to try the product and all that. And so disastrous effects for them. And but mostly I just like these because a lot of them get really, really funny. And so what do I mean? Well, there are plenty of examples, and most of these examples I'm going to give are American companies selling products in other countries, but it's not specifically and uniquely American. Other countries have companies that have made similar blunders. Like, for example, there's IKEA, who, of course, this company comes from Sweden originally, and so Swedish and Thai are very, very different languages. And so IKEA, they are in many countries around the world. And so they were in Thailand and they wanted to introduce a new set of cups. You know, IKEA does home furnishings and whatnot. So they wanted to introduce a new set of cups. And they didn't think of uh, what would this word sound like it means in Thai? Would this be something people want to buy or not? And that's because they just went with their own word, Slatin, um, which in Thai sounds like dead or deceased. And so well, as you can imagine, people really didn't want to try out those cups too much. And so they lost out on a bunch of sales of them and all that. And if only they had just done a little background research and try to see how does this sound to someone who speaks Thai, which is the language they're speaking there more than any other. And yeah, anyway, so it's kind of sad for IKEA, and but companies often they end up making it just afterwards, and eventually selling their products. But um, it gets a whole lot worse than this example here, and it gets a whole lot funnier too. For instance, we got the American company Procter and Gamble. They make puffs, tissues, among other products. But so they were trying to introduce these in multiple parts of Europe. Um, and the funny part here is that the languages they're translating between are not really so far from each other, not so different. So it seems like any mistakes made here are a little less forgivable. And for one, English is a Germanic language, so we have a lot of things in common with um, Dutch and German, for instance. And yeah, still, we can bother doing a little research to know that puffs, uh, in the singular puff in Germany, that's a term, like, I think it's a kind of slangish term for a brothel. So imagine you got a foreign company coming into your country and they're trying to sell you a box of tissues named whorehouse or something, right? It's not very good. And so it's really unsurprising that puffs are not hugely successful in Germany the way that Kleenex and softies are. And they could have just, well, adapted their name a little bit, not to sound like brothel, and it would have worked out better. But the worst part about this is uh, failing to take, if they're sending these products over to Europe, and one of the places they're sending them to was the United Kingdom. And they also speak English, right? The US and the UK both speak English, so that should not come with any linguistic problems, right? But stinking Procter and Gamble didn't even do the research to know that puff in the UK is an incredibly offensive slur, right? This is a very pejorative word that you might use for a gay man, right? And so it's very offensive. And so, also, again, in the UK, puffs not so popular as they are here, of course. They do have Kleenex and all that too, but if only Procter and Gamble had thought to be a little more culturally sensitive when it comes to the name of their product in Germany and the United Kingdom, they could have had a better market share, I think, for the tissue sales and all that. So that I would say is only their fault, and it is, well, pretty funny that they couldn't translate American English to British English, right? Anyway, that to me is really funny when is not even translating between different languages, but different varieties of the same language, and they can't be bothered to do that even that much. And that's why we got to avoid the cultural imperialism that is just sticking our language onto them, onto the others, instead of meeting them and trying to get what their own language is like, and what kind of an impact that could have on the product. Anyway, and this is not even the worst. In France, there was an issue when the company Colgate tried to introduce a new toothpaste in France, um, which in English we say Q. In French, Q. That would be the French pronunciation, Q. And this one is so funny because when I hear the word Q in French, I immediately go to a kind of swear word. The word Q, spelled Cul in French, that's is sort of a swear word. It's your ass, pretty much. It's a part of the body. It's the ass. And this is funny because you don't want people thinking of that when you're trying to sell them toothpaste, for one. But the other part is when I think of Q, uh, one thing that comes to mind is porno magazines. And why is that? Because Magazine de Q, those would be erotic magazines. It's not one particular magazine's title or anything, but that's, yeah, what you would call porno mags in France. So, yeah, so Colgate trying to introduce the toothpaste with a name that sounds like that was never going to go well for them, right? So that's funny to me. And then now the French are super upset and super prudish about anything related to sex or anything. But honestly, um, thinking about ass really gives you no desire to want to brush your teeth, right? Anyway, so they should have done better and could have done better, but they didn't. And now, one place that a lot of English speaking companies have had trouble getting translations right is China. And the Kentucky Fried Chicken example I'm about to give is a really well known gaffe in advertising when it comes to uh, international corporations and whatnot. Because the thing is, KFC had this slogan, finger licking good, right? And we Americans, we get that because to us, if you eat something with your hands instead of utensils, of course, uh, you might end up licking off your fingers at the end of it. And so we all know what that means, finger licking good. It means, oh, it's going to taste really good when you're licking your fingers off at the end. But the problem is in China, licking your fingers after eating was totally not a food custom in any way. So finger licking good doesn't really compute that easily. And so we think of finger licking good in the US, we already get what the reference is. But in China, how they interpreted it, when you translate this fairly literally, uh, it gets you something more like eat your fingers, they're delicious. Or, yeah, eating your fingers is good. Um, so there's really no, it's not just about licking them off anymore. And all of a sudden it's about eating your fingers. And that to me is really funny because nobody wants to eat their own fingers, right? And yeah, and KFC really should have thought about that before they just went and translated their slogan literally into Chinese as if the Chinese would understand it. You know, a little cultural sensitivity helps. It goes a long way in translations to make sure that what they're going to understand is what you mean by this and not something else like eating your damn fingers. And so again, part of this is cultural insensitivity, but also in general, translating between English and Chinese is very difficult. And English speakers say that Chinese is the most difficult language to translate to and from. But I bet they would say something similar about English. Because it goes both ways, really. But both of the biggest uh, soda pop manufacturing companies in the US have also had issues in China. Let's start with Pepsi. So Pepsi in China, and both Pepsi and Coca-Cola, in my opinion, part of why they ran into such difficulty getting translations to be something decent is because they were trying to translate phonetically, trying to get to a word in Mandarin or another variety of Chinese language. They wanted something that would sound the same. So they're trying to translate phonetically. And to me, that doesn't make any sense because Mandarin and English are so very different. There's no good reason. Like translation, the goal of translation is not to get a word that sounds the same in both languages. What you want to get is a word that means the same in both languages. Very different thing. And so Pepsi had the whole, I don't know if you remember the whole Pepsi generation marketing campaign, as if Pepsi drinkers were a whole new generation and all that. And we wanted to get people to be part of the Pepsi generation. But because of the uh, phonetic translation for uh, Pepsi, means, but again, because of the phonetic in translation of Pepsi, they came up with something like Bao Bei, and I'm not going to even try to pronounce Chinese because it's a tonal language, and so sometimes whatever tone that you're using will totally change the meaning of a word. And I don't get the tones in Mandarin or any other Chinese language variety, so I'm not even going to try to get them. But what I can tell you is it ended up translating as far as its meaning went as precious generation. And so, what the heck does that mean? To me, that's hard to understand, even just keeping it in English. And in China, how did people interpret that, the precious generation part of this? um, is death of father. So it would mean, well, the death of a former generation, right? The death of a father. And that does not bring good things to mind, right? That's not going to get anybody to try to buy your product or to want to drink your product or anything like that. And it gets even weirder. Bear in mind, death, death of father being linked to uh, Press's generation, which was an attempted translation of Pepsi generation. In in China, they also kept this whole advertising marketing campaign going, where we were in the U.S. saying "Come alive" with the Pepsi generation. Now, if you remember the whole Pepsi generation, aka process generation, aka death of father thing they had going on. So when they try to translate "Come Alive" with the Pepsi generation, what this came across as is Pepsi brings your ancestors back from the grave. That to me is funny, because that's obviously really, really not what they meant. And it clearly did not help with their sales on that much. So Pepsi totally could have done better in China over the course of the 20th century, uh, if they had just, uh, bothered to come up with stuff that sounded catchy in Chinese, right? As opposed to just trying to translate phonetically and then to literally and then cramming it down their throats. Pepsi brings your ancestors back from the grave. See, that's anyway. So Pepsi should have done a lot better than they did. Now, how did Coke do? Coca-Cola in China, they made this similar mistake of trying to translate Coca-Cola phonetically, right? And so they came up with this word. And again, I'm not going to try to pronounce it because I don't get the tones right in this language. And so, but that was the first word they try to use. And it kind of meant bite the wax tadpole, or maybe something more accurately as biting a wax tadpole. But either way, does that make you want to drink their beverage if they're talking about biting a wax tadpole? Does that make you want to put anything in your mouth? I don't think so. Or not me anyway. And so this one, luckily for Coca-Cola, they ended up doing a little better than Pepsi did when they decided to fix their mistake and try to come up with a new similar sounding word uh, that's going to mean something better. And they did a pretty good job as far as that goes. So they changed their name of Coca-Cola, the translated name of it, into something that sounds very similar but not identical to the original one. And it means something so much better for marketing soda, right? It means happiness in the mouth, aka happiness is delicious, aka they're reminding you that Coca-Cola brings you delicious happiness. And that, to me, makes a lot more sense if you're trying to get people to drink your sugar water that's really bad for them or anything and everything. As long as you create deliciousness of Coke with happiness, that seems like a really good way to go about it. So I'm gonna give Coke a little credit well for correcting their mistake, and they really did very well with this. Of course, Coca-Cola is still pretty popular in China today, and so they obviously did a whole lot better than Pepsi did as far as getting across something, uh, getting across a feeling that their product is enjoyable to the Chinese. Anyway, so that to me is good on them. And, American soda companies are not the only ones that have had issues when it comes to car companies. We've had some things going on too. And not when trying to sell cars all the way over in Asia or in Europe. We're talking in the Americas. We're talking introducing markets, American cars to uh, other countries in the Americas. And so in Brazil, um, there's an issue because, okay, I guess Ford forgot to check and see what language do they speak in Brazil, which is Portuguese. And because if they had, then maybe they would have checked what does the word pinto mean in Portuguese. And it's not something good. It's not something that's going to help them sell a car, is it? It's a slang word for, well, for male genitalia, pretty much. And so obviously they couldn't stick with that for too long. And it's too bad that they didn't um, really look it up or figure this out before they released the car in Brazil, right? Because they lost out on a whole lot of sales and they had to sort of correct their actions a little bit by changing the name from Pinto to uh, this other word that's for sale. And that word seems like a good one for me for a car because it's a reference to a horse. And it's very literary type word in Portuguese. So I wouldn't translate it literally as horse, more like stallion or steed, but still, it's a reference to a horse, which is appropriate if you're talking about your ride, a car. And so Ford was not the only American motor car company that had an issue in uh, in Latin America. And so in Latin America, aside from Brazil, we've got most of these countries are Spanish speaking, right? Spanish would be the majority language of most of the countries that we consider Latin American company, right? Or Latin American countries, right? And somebody at Chevrolet should have asked some Spanish speaker, what does Nova mean? Before they try to introduce the car in Latin America. And Nova is not actually one word in Spanish, but it's split into two words, Nova. And if you say Nova in Spanish, it means it doesn't run, like it doesn't go, aka this car doesn't work. So they released it with the title Nova. And so all the Spanish speakers heard this and well saw this on the card and all that and thought of Nova, which means it doesn't work. So they automatically thought that this car has serious mechanical issues. It won't work, and so don't bother buying it. And so all it would have taken was just a little investigation, uh, like having an actual Spanish speaker present when you're doing your when you're trying to think of is this a good name for this car in a Spanish speaking country because if they had consulted anybody, I bet they would have helped them out on this anyway. So yeah, that is really funny too that they called their car doesn't work or they called their car doesn't run in Latin America. So obviously, Chevy could have done better with their sales down there if they had not accidentally told everybody that the car doesn't run, but that is really funny. So I was coming up with all these blundered translations from corporations around the world. And it all reminded me that sometimes there can be an impact on the culture, um, of the culture of the country where you're trying to sell your product. And that is a little different than the examples that we've seen so far. And you might remember this example from a video I did about maybe almost a year ago. Um, and so this is about Valentine's Day in Japan. So this is, I know that most of the companies I brought up are American companies, but they're not the only ones that make these kind of mistakes, right? IKEA is not an American company for one. Now, this one I would blame on probably British confectionery companies, like British companies who are trying to make candies and sell candies and chocolates and all that stuff. And so they're trying to get, I think it was a Chinese subsidiary of a British confectionery company in question here. But they're trying to break into the market to sell lots of chocolates for Valentine's Day in Japan, right? Everybody knows that Valentine's Day is a pretty big commercial holiday in a lot of countries. Buying chocolates or gifts for your loved one and all that. That makes a lot of money. That that brings in a lot of money for a lot of companies. And so they were wondering, well, this confectionery company wanted to make it sure that people knew what the chocolates were for, right? Why would you buy these chocolates? What is the point of this? And the fact is, there was totally a misunderstanding of what they told because they translated this very directly from English into Japanese. And so their instructions were these chocolates are intended for women because they meant, the confectionery company meant that men should buy these chocolates and then give them as gifts to women for Valentine's Day, right? That's what they meant. But that is not how the Japanese interpreted this. How they interpreted this is kind of funny. The chocolates are intended for women. How they interpreted this was now the women were the one that went out and bought the chocolates, and then they would give them as presents to their man. And I know this is all very heteronormative, a very heterosexual couple Valentine's Day. But anyway, um, so instead of what the chocolate makers wanted, which was for men to buy a bunch of chocolates and give them to women, they ended up having women buy a bunch of chocolates and give them to men instead. But that to me is super interesting because this caused a real cultural change. Because although they did get Valentine's Day, the presents moving in one direction and the opposite direction than the chocolate company made, you know that okay, February 14th is Valentine's Day. So in Japan, traditionally you've got women buying chocolates, giving them to men. And this begat, I think they call it White Day, which is 1 month later, March 14th. All of a sudden, um, men are buying gifts and presents and whatnot and giving them to women. So they actually in Japan got two different holidays out of this. Instead of couples buying presents for each other on the same day, Valentine's Day, like a lot of us kind of expect in the US, um, really it's you got two holidays out of the deal. In February you got the women buying stuff for the men, and then in March you got the men buying stuff for the women. So it's very cool. This weird misunderstanding led to a nice little cultural evolution in Japan, and I just didn't want to do this video without mentioning that, because although this was a blunder as far as don't translate so directly, because people might not understand it exactly the way you're intending, because in the other language might come across different. And yeah, so but to me that's really funny because all of a sudden now we got Japan with two holidays a month from apart, and it's sort of egalitarian that way. Women give it to men, and then men give it to women. And I do wonder what gay couples do in that case. As a gay man, having gender roles involved in your present giving doesn't really make much sense in the couples I'm involved with anyway. But anyway, thank you so much for watching this little video about translation blunders by big companies. And please do give it a like. Please do drop a little thumbs up on this video. And if you're not subscribed yet, please do consider subscribing. I would really appreciate that very much. And I'm very much looking forward to talking to you next time. So until then, catch you around next time. Bye bye.